December 20, 1943. 8 miles above Bremen, Germany. Second Lieutenant Charles Brown pressed his oxygen mask tighter against his face and watched the contrails of 50 B-17 bombers stretching across the frozen sky like chalk lines on a blue slate. His bomber, Ye Olde Pub, rode in the formation's belly, engines thrumming steady at 27,000 feet. The air outside was 60 degrees below zero. Inside the cockpit, frost collected on every metal surface despite the crew's heavy flight suits and electric gloves. They were 2 hours from home. 2 hours from warmth, from safety, from the illusion that war happened somewhere else to someone else. Brown was 21 years old. He'd been flying combat missions for 6 weeks. This was his first tour as a pilot, his second mission to Germany, and he carried with him the certainty that all young pilots carry, that death happens to other crews, not his. He'd seen bombers fall. Watched them spiral down trailing smoke and fire. Counted parachutes blooming white against winter clouds. But that was theater, distant and unreal, something observed through plexiglass at 300 miles per hour. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke, sat to his right, hands light on the controls, watching the formation. Behind them, in the fuselage, 8 more men rode their stations. Ball turret gunner. Waist gunners. Radio operator. Navigator. Bombardier. Tail gunner. 10 men sealed in aluminum and plexiglass, breathing bottled oxygen, watching the sky. The mission brief had been simple. Bremen's industrial district. FW-190 assembly plants. Kriegsmarine submarine construction yards. Drop your bombs, return to base, debrief in the operations room with hot coffee and cigarettes. The briefing officer had mentioned fighter opposition. Luftwaffe presence likely. But the 8th Air Force had fighter escort now, P-47 Thunderbolts riding alongside, keeping the German interceptors at bay. What the briefing officer hadn't mentioned was what happened when the escorts ran low on fuel and turned back. What happened when 50 B-17s flew on alone through German airspace, slow and heavy, visible for 100 miles in every direction. The bombs fell over Bremen at 1,143 hours. Brown felt the aircraft lift as 4,000 pounds of high explosive left the bomb bay. Below, the city disappeared beneath blooming flowers of smoke and flame. Then they turned west, heading for England, heading home. The formation tightened. Pilots adjusted throttles, holding position, watching for stragglers. That's when the fighters came. They appeared first as tiny black specks against the horizon, growing rapidly larger. FW-190s and B-190s, maybe 30 of them, climbing fast, attacking from below and behind. The bomber formation's defensive guns opened fire. 50 caliber machine guns hammering, tracers arcing out in streams of light. The German fighters pressed through the fire, rolled inverted, dove on the bombers from above. Ye Olde Pub took its first hit at 1,147 hours. 20mm cannon shells punched through the right wing, tearing aluminum like paper. The aircraft shuddered. Brown gripped the controls. More shells struck the fuselage, the tail section, the number 3 engine. The engine caught fire. Brown hit the extinguisher. The fire went out, but the engine was dead, windmilling uselessly. Then the nose exploded. A cannon shell detonated in the bombardier's compartment. The plexiglass nose shattered. Freezing wind roared through the aircraft. The bombardier and navigator were hit, bleeding, unconscious. The intercom went dead. Brown couldn't reach the crew, couldn't hear the gunners, couldn't coordinate defense. Another fighter attacked from 6 o'clock high. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, fired back, but he was wounded, barely conscious. Shell after shell hammered into Ye Olde Pub. The number 4 engine seized. 2 engines gone now. The aircraft began losing altitude, falling behind the formation. Brown pushed the throttles forward on the remaining engines. They were at 16,000 feet now, dropping fast. The oxygen system failed. The crew began to suffocate. Brown tore off his mask and gulped thin air, vision swimming, head pounding. Around him, the formation pulled away. The other bombers couldn't slow down, couldn't wait. Survival meant staying together. Ye Olde Pub was alone now, crippled and falling, a wounded animal separated from the herd. At 11,000 feet, Brown leveled off. The aircraft was barely controllable. Hydraulics failing. Flight controls damaged. Half the crew wounded or unconscious. The tail section was shredded, the fuselage perforated with hundreds of holes. Fuel streamed from ruptured tanks in the wings. Brown looked at the instruments. Airspeed, 135 knots. Altitude, 11,000 feet. Heading, west. Distance to England, 250 miles. He did the math. 30 minutes of flying with 2 engines, if they didn't fail. If the fuel lasted. If the aircraft held together. He never saw the German fighter until it was beside him. The Me-109 appeared off the right wing, maybe 50 feet away. Close enough that Brown could see the pilot's face, the yellow nose paint, the black crosses on the fuselage. Close enough to count rivets. Close enough to die. Brown's hands froze on the controls. This was it. The final attack. The coup de grace. The German pilot had only to squeeze his trigger, send a 3-second burst into Ye Olde Pub's cockpit, and 10 Americans would fall burning into the German countryside. But the trigger never came. The Me-109 held position, flying formation with the crippled bomber. The German pilot looked across the gap between aircraft. His eyes met Brown's. Neither man moved. The moment stretched, suspended between violence and mercy, between what was expected and what was possible. Then the German pilot did something Brown would remember for the rest of his life. He raised his hand. A simple gesture. Not a salute, not a wave. Just acknowledgement. One pilot to another. A signal that said, *I see you. I see your situation. And I'm making a choice, *. The Me-109 moved ahead, positioning itself in front of the bomber. The German pilot looked back over his shoulder, made a hand motion. Follow me. Brown didn't understand. Follow where? Why? But the alternative was falling out of the sky or getting shot down by the next fighter that found them, so Brown followed. The German pilot led them away from populated areas, away from flak batteries, away from other German fighters that might not exercise the same restraint. He flew ahead of Ye Olde Pub, visible and obvious, his presence communicating to anyone watching from the ground, "This aircraft is under my protection." They flew together for 15 minutes. The German pilot periodically glanced back, checking that the bomber was still following. Brown focused on keeping the aircraft level, maintaining what little altitude remained. At 8,000 feet, they crossed the German coast. The North Sea spread before them, grey and infinite. The German pilot pulled alongside one final time. He locked eyes with Brown again. Then he nodded once, slowly and deliberately. He banked away, heading back toward Germany. Brown watched him go, watched the Me-109 shrink to a speck and disappear into the eastern sky. Ye Olde Pub limped across the North Sea alone. Brown coaxed the 2 remaining engines, nursed the failing hydraulics, held the aircraft together through sheer will. The crew slowly regained consciousness. The wounded applied makeshift bandages. They threw everything loose out the waist windows, ammunition, equipment, personal gear, desperate to lighten the aircraft. They made landfall over England at 1,400 hours. Brown found an emergency airfield, a fighter base with a short runway. The landing gear wouldn't extend. The hydraulics were dead. Brown brought the bomber in on its belly, skidding across grass and dirt in a shower of sparks and torn metal. When the aircraft finally stopped, all 10 crew members were alive. Brown sat in the cockpit for a long time after the engines died. His hands shook. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold. He kept seeing that German pilot's face, kept replaying that moment when mercy replaced murder, when one man chose not to kill. The intelligence officers who debriefed him didn't believe it at first. A German fighter escorting a damaged American bomber to safety? Impossible. Against orders. Against doctrine. Against everything the war taught them about enemies and hatred and necessity. But Brown's crew confirmed every detail. They'd all seen it. The Me-109 flying alongside. The German pilot leading them away from danger. The final nod before he turned back. It had happened. Against all logic and expectation and military sense, it had happened. What Brown didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the German pilot had violated every regulation in the Luftwaffe manual. That he'd risked court-martial and execution. That his choice to spare one American bomber crew contradicted explicit orders from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself. What Brown didn't know was the German pilot's name, his rank, his reasons. He didn't know anything except that somewhere over Bremen, a moment had occurred that shouldn't exist in war, a fragment of humanity that persisted despite everything designed to destroy it. And he didn't know that 46 years would pass before he learned the truth. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sat in his Me-109's cockpit at Jever Airfield and watched the American bomber formations passing overhead. It was December 20, 1943, and he'd been flying combat missions since 1940. 3 years of war. North Africa, Sicily, the Eastern Front, now Germany. He'd shot down 27 Allied aircraft. 5 more kills would make him an ace, earn him the Knight's Cross, secure his place in Luftwaffe history. He was 28 years old. Old for a fighter pilot. Most didn't last a year. He'd survived through skill, experience, and something else, a code instilled by his first squadron commander, a World War I veteran named Gustav Rodel who'd flown with the Red Baron's flying circus. Rodel's rules were simple. Attack aircraft. Never strafe parachutes. Never shoot at crews in life rafts. Never forget that behind every gun sight is a man who might have been your friend in a different world. Honor your enemy's courage. Fight fiercely, but remember your humanity when the fighting stops. In 1943, those rules felt like relics from a different war. The Eastern Front had stripped away such courtesies. The firebombing of German cities had turned warfare into mutual annihilation. Göring's directive was explicit: destroy every Allied aircraft. No mercy. No exceptions. Germany's survival demanded it. But Stigler had been raised differently. His father had fought in World War I, came home believing that war without rules descended into barbarism. His brother August, also a Luftwaffe pilot, had been shot down over England in 1940. Stigler didn't know if August had survived, if British pilots had shown him mercy. He hoped they had. When the Alert scrambled at 1,145 hours, Stigler was low on fuel. He'd already flown one mission that morning, attacking B-17 formations over Bremen. He'd scored hits but no kills. Now his squadron was launching again, a final intercept before the Americans reached the coast. Stigler took off, climbed to intercept altitude, and scanned the sky for targets. He found one at 11,000 feet. A B-17 straggling behind the formation, both right engines dead or failing, fuselage shredded, barely maintaining altitude. An easy kill. He approached from behind and below, standard attack angle, finger on the trigger. His cannon was fully loaded. 1 3-second burst would finish it. Then he got close enough to see inside. Through the shattered tail section, he saw the tail gunner slumped over his guns, unconscious or dead. Through holes in the fuselage, he saw crew members moving, tending to wounded. Through the missing nose plexiglass, he saw the pilots fighting the controls, struggling to keep the aircraft flying. The bomber wasn't a threat. It was a wreck held together by willpower and thin aluminum skin. Stigler pulled alongside. He looked at the pilot. Young. Maybe 20. Terrified but determined. The kid glanced over, saw the Me-109, accepted death. And Stigler couldn't do it. Everything in his training said shoot. Everything in military doctrine said enemy aircraft must be destroyed. Everything in the desperate arithmetic of total war said this bomber represented bombs that would fall on German cities, resources devoted to killing German soldiers, American air power that must be eliminated. But Stigler saw something else. He saw 10 men who'd already faced death and survived. Men who'd completed their mission, dropped their bombs, earned their chance to go home. Men who posed no further threat. Men who, if their positions were reversed, he hoped would show him the same mercy. He thought of Rodel's words. You are fighter pilots first, killers second. Never kill a man who's already beaten. Stigler made his choice. He pulled ahead of the bomber and motioned for the pilot to follow. He would escort them out of German airspace, shield them from other fighters, guide them to the coast. It was insane. It was court-martial. It was treason. It was the only thing he could do and still call himself a man. They flew together for 15 minutes. Other German fighters appeared in the distance. Stigler positioned himself between them and the bomber, making it clear, "This one is mine. Stay clear." Anti-aircraft batteries began tracking the bomber. Stigler rocked his wings, waggled his aircraft, the standard signal for friendly aircraft, confusing the gunners below. At the coast, he pulled alongside one final time. He looked at the American pilot and nodded. "You're on your own now. Good luck." Then he banked hard right and dove back toward Germany, expecting at any moment to be spotted, reported, arrested. He landed at Jever, taxied to his revetment, shut down the engine. His crew chief approached with the standard question, "How'd it go?" Stigler said, "I watched a B-17 limp out to sea. Couldn't finish it." The crew chief nodded and asked no more questions. Some things were better left unreported. Stigler never told anyone. Not his squadron mates. Not his commanders. Not the intelligence officers who tallied victories. He flew 40 more combat missions, survived the war, and carried that secret for 46 years. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that crippled bomber, that young pilot's face, that moment when everything he'd been taught about war collided with everything he believed about being human. He'd chosen mercy. And he never knew if it had been the right choice, whether those 10 Americans had made it home, whether his decision had meant anything beyond his own conscience. Not knowing was the hardest part. Charles Brown returned to combat operations in January 1944. His crew was given a new B-17, new missions, new chances to die. They completed their 25-mission tour, beat the odds, went home. Brown was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. His co-pilot, Spencer Luke, received the Air Medal. The rest of the crew got their honorable discharges and tried to forget. But Brown couldn't forget. The image of that German pilot haunted him. Not in nightmares, but in quiet moments. When he was flying, he'd glance to the right and expect to see and meet 109 keeping formation. When he was on the ground, safe in England, then later in America, he'd think about that moment of mercy and wonder, why? What made one man choose compassion when everything in war demanded killing? He told the story occasionally. To fellow pilots. To family. To anyone who'd listen. But it sounded implausible even to him. A German fighter pilot protecting an American bomber. Escorting it to safety. In the middle of a war where both sides firebombed cities and killed millions. Nobody quite believed it. Not really. It was a nice story. A comforting myth. An anomaly too unlikely to be true. After the war, Brown went home to West Virginia. He got married. Had children. Built a career as an engineer. Lived a normal life. But he never stopped thinking about that German pilot. Never stopped wondering who he was, why he'd done it, whether he'd survived the war. In 1986, Brown was 64 years old. Retired. Comfortable. Haunted by questions he'd carried for 43 years. He decided to find answers. He joined veterans organizations. Attended bomber crew reunions. Talked to historians. Researched Luftwaffe records. He learned that finding one specific German pilot among thousands was nearly impossible. The Luftwaffe had lost most of its records in the war's final months. Pilots had been killed, captured, scattered. Even if the pilot had survived, he might not want to be found. Might not want to admit he'd violated orders. Brown wrote letters. To German veterans groups. To aviation magazines. To anyone who might have information. He described the encounter, December 20, 1943. Near Bremen. Me, 109 with a yellow nose. Pilot who escorted a damaged B-17 to the coast. Does anyone remember? Does anyone know who this pilot was? The letters went unanswered. Months passed. Then years. Brown's wife suggested he let it go. Maybe the pilot had died. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. The war had been over for 40 years. Why chase ghosts? But Brown couldn't let it go. That moment had defined his life more than any other. More than his missions. More than his medals. More than his career. That moment when an enemy became something else, a reminder that humanity persisted even in humanity's darkest hours. He needed to know the man's name. Needed to thank him. Needed to confirm that mercy, once given, hadn't been wasted. In 1989, Brown wrote one more letter. This time to a combat pilot newsletter. He described the encounter again, included more details, asked one final time, "Does anyone know who this German pilot was?" In East Germany, Franz Stigler read that newsletter. He was 74 years old. Living in Vancouver, Canada, where he'd immigrated after the war. He'd never told anyone about that day over Bremen. Not his wife. Not his children. It had been his secret, his burden, his choice that might have been wrong or right but could never be undone. When he read Brown's letter, he felt something shift. The weight he'd carried for 46 years suddenly had a name, a face, a destination. The American pilot had survived. Had made it home. Had lived a full life. The mercy given hadn't been wasted. Stigler picked up a pen and began writing. His hand shook slightly. The words came slowly at first, then faster. He described December 20th, 1943, from his perspective. The crippled bomber. The decision he'd made. The escort to the coast. The risk he'd taken. The secret he'd kept. He mailed the letter to the newsletter, addressed it to Second Lieutenant Charles Brown, hoped it would reach him, hoped Brown would believe it, hoped Brown wouldn't hate him for being German, for fighting for the wrong side, for representing the enemy. 2 weeks later, the phone rang in Brown's house in Florida. They met in person in 1990. A hotel in Seattle. Brown flew from Florida. Stigler drove from Vancouver. Neither man knew what to expect. 47 years had passed. They'd been enemies once. Could enemies become friends? Could mercy given and mercy received create a bond strong enough to bridge decades and nations and the memory of war? Brown arrived first. Sat in the hotel lobby. Nervous. Anxious. Wondering if Stigler would even show up. Wondering what you say to the man who saved your life. Then Stigler walked through the door. Brown recognized him instantly. Same eyes. Same face, though older now, weathered by 75 years of living. They stared at each other across the lobby. Two old men who'd been young once, who'd faced each other over 8 miles of German sky with murder between them and mercy given. Stigler crossed the lobby. Extended his hand. Said, in accented English, "You're the pilot. From the B-17. Brown took his hand. And you're the fighter pilot who saved us." They sat. Talked. Showed each other photographs. Brown had pictures of his crew, his aircraft, the damage Ye Olde Pub had sustained. Stigler had logbooks, mission records, descriptions of that December day. The details matched. Every memory confirmed. It had happened. It was real. They'd found each other. Why? Brown asked. Why didn't you shoot us down? Stigler was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was soft. I saw your crew. They were wounded. Your aircraft was destroyed. You'd already been beaten. My commander, a man I respected, taught me that you are fighter pilots first, killers second. He said you never kill a man who's already lost. I couldn't forget that. Even when the war demanded I forget everything human. Brown asked about the risk. About what would have happened if Stigler had been caught. Court-martial, Stigler said. Probably execution. Göring's directive was absolute. Every Allied aircraft must be destroyed. What I did was treason. But I couldn't shoot you. I just couldn't. They talked for hours. About the war. About survival. About carrying secrets. About the weight of choices made in moments when there's no time to think, only time to act according to instincts shaped by training and conscience and whatever makes us human beneath the uniform. Stigler asked if the crew had survived. Brown told him they all had. All 10 men made it home. The bombardier and navigator recovered from their wounds. The tail gunner survived despite losing blood. Every man lived because Stigler had chosen mercy. I'm glad, Stigler said. His eyes were wet. For 47 years, I wondered. I didn't know if you'd made it. Didn't know if my decision meant anything. Now I know. Thank you for finding me. They met again. Repeatedly. Brown and Stigler became friends. They attended air shows together. Gave interviews together. Told their story to anyone who'd listen. They wrote a book together, titled A Higher Call, documenting their encounter and the 47-year search that followed. The story became famous. Veterans on both sides recognized something in it, a reminder that war, for all its horror, couldn't completely destroy the human capacity for mercy. That even in extremity, even when orders and doctrine and national survival demanded killing, individual men could still choose differently. Brown and Stigler spent their final years as brothers. Not figuratively, but truly. They called each other weekly. Visited each other's families. Celebrated holidays together. The war that had tried to make them enemies had ultimately created the deepest friendship either man had ever known. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, at age 92. Charles Brown died 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, at age 87. They died as they'd lived after 1990, as brothers, as friends, as proof that mercy, once given, echoes forward through decades and generations. The story of Brown and Stigler spread through veteran communities like a slow wave. It appeared in aviation magazines, history documentaries, veteran newsletters. It was told at reunions, at memorials, at ceremonies honoring the fallen. And it changed something in how people understood the war. World War II had been taught as absolute. Good versus evil. Allies versus Axis. Democracy versus fascism. The narrative allowed no room for nuance, no space for mercy between enemies, no acknowledgement that men on both sides were still men, capable of both cruelty and compassion. Brown and Stigler's story challenged that narrative. It said, war is absolute, but men aren't. Orders are absolute, but conscience isn't. Nations fight to the death, but individuals can choose differently. Former bomber crewmen came forward with similar stories. A German fighter pilot who'd waggled his wings to warn an American crew their hydraulics were failing. A British pilot who'd escorted a damaged German bomber away from anti-aircraft fire. Small moments of mercy, unreported and forgotten, emerging from memory after decades of silence. These stories didn't excuse the war. They didn't diminish its horror. Millions had died. Cities had burned. Nations had been destroyed. Nothing could change that. But Brown and Stigler's story suggested that even in the darkest time, fragments of humanity persisted. That mercy, once offered, could mean survival not just for bodies but for souls. Luftwaffe veterans, particularly those who'd survived on the Eastern Front, wrote to Stigler. They told him they understood his choice, that they too had faced moments where orders conflicted with conscience. Some had chosen mercy. Others hadn't, and carried the weight of that choice into old age. One veteran, a former Me-109 pilot named Heinrich who'd flown in Russia, wrote, "I shot down 23 Soviet aircraft. I strafed parachuting pilots. I followed orders. I thought it made me a better soldier. Now I'm 84 and I can't sleep. I see their faces. Young men, like your American pilot. I wish I'd been strong enough to do what you did. To choose mercy over duty. You saved more than one crew that day. You saved yourself." The psychological research bore this out. Veterans who'd committed atrocities, on all sides, suffered higher rates of PTSD, depression, suicide. Not because they'd faced danger, but because they'd violated their own sense of humanity. They'd done what war demanded, and it had broken something inside them that couldn't be repaired. Stigler had faced that same moment and chosen differently. He'd violated orders to preserve his conscience. And that choice, that moment of mercy, had allowed him to live with himself. To survive the war not just physically but psychologically. To become the man he wanted to be rather than the soldier war tried to make him. Brown, too, carried something from that encounter. Not guilt, but gratitude. He'd been given a second chance, a gift of life when death was certain. That gift had shaped how he lived. Made him kinder. More forgiving. More willing to see humanity in others, even former enemies. The encounter changed their children too. Brown's daughter, sitting at her father's funeral, met Stigler's daughter. They hugged. Wept together. Two families united by their father's choice, by mercy given and received, by a story that said war doesn't have to destroy everything beautiful in human nature. Military academies began teaching Brown and Stigler's story. Not as a tactical lesson, but as an ethical one. At what point does following orders become wrong? When does the individual conscience outweigh military necessity? How do you balance duty to your nation with duty to your humanity? These weren't abstract questions. Young officers preparing for combat needed to understand that war would test them in ways no training could prepare them for. That they'd face moments where the easy choice and the right choice diverged. That how they responded would define them far more than any medal or commendation. Brown and Stigler's story said, in that moment, choose mercy if you can. Choose humanity if possible. The war will end. The orders will cease. But you'll carry your choices forever. Make choices you can live with. The story answers some questions. Why Stigler didn't shoot. Why Brown survived. How two enemies became brothers. But it raises others, harder to answer, perhaps impossible to answer. What if Stigler had followed orders? 10 Americans would have died. Brown's wife would have received a telegram, raised their children alone. His grandchildren would never have been born. The ripples of that single decision, shoot or don't shoot, would have cascaded through generations. But there's another side. Stigler violated explicit orders. He risked execution. If he'd been caught, he'd have been shot as a traitor. His family would have lived under that shame. His choice to spare 10 enemies might have cost his own life. Was mercy worth that risk? Is individual conscience more important than military discipline? In an army where soldiers must follow orders, where hesitation means defeat, where mercy toward enemies might lead to your nation's destruction, can mercy be justified? The answer depends on what you value. If you value winning above all else, then no, mercy can't be justified. War is about killing the enemy before they kill you. Stigler should have fired. That he didn't was weakness, sentiment, a failure of duty. But if you value humanity, if you believe that some things matter more than victory, then Stigler's choice becomes different. It becomes evidence that even in war, men can choose to remain human. That orders don't erase conscience. That mercy, when given, doesn't diminish strength, it affirms it. Stigler himself struggled with this question. He told Brown once, late in their friendship, I don't know if I did the right thing. I disobeyed orders. I put my personal feelings above my duty. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe those 10 men went on to drop more bombs, kill more Germans. Maybe my mercy caused more death. Brown's response, or maybe your mercy reminded everyone that we're all human. That even in the worst war in history, individual men could still choose compassion. That matters too. Maybe more than the tactical outcome. There's no resolving this. War and ethics exist in different universes. War demands efficiency, ruthlessness, the subordination of individual conscience to collective survival. Ethics demands the opposite, that individual conscience matters most, that human life is sacred regardless of uniform or nationality, that mercy is never wrong. Brown and Stigler's encounter existed in a tension between these forces. And perhaps that's the point. Not that there's an answer, but that the question persists. That in the darkest moments, when everything says kill, some men still pause. Still consider. Still choose differently. That choice doesn't end wars. Doesn't prevent atrocities. Doesn't guarantee peace. But it preserves something essential, the knowledge that humanity can persist even when everything conspires to destroy it. That 10 men in a falling bomber and 1 man in a fighter can, for 15 minutes, exist outside the war's logic. Can be, briefly, just men helping each other survive. There's a grave in Florida where Charles Brown is buried. And a grave in Vancouver where Franz Stigler rests. They're separated by 3,000 miles, an ocean, an entire continent. But their families visit both. Brown's descendants bring flowers to Stigler's grave. Stigler's descendants do the same for Brown. The friendship that began in mercy continues past death. Veterans organizations use their story in PTSD counseling. Soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, carrying the weight of things they've done and seen, find something in Brown and Stigler's encounter. Not absolution, their experiences are too different for that. But possibility. The possibility that mercy, once given or received, can heal wounds that medicine can't reach. A museum in England displays photographs of Brown and Stigler together in their 80s, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling. Visitors, British, American, German, all nationalities, stop and read the placard explaining their story. Some cry. Others stand silent, thinking about fathers and grandfathers who fought, who died, who came home changed. The photographs say, this is possible. Enemies can become friends. Mercy can transcend hatred. The war tried to destroy everything human, and it failed. Not completely, too many died, too much was lost. But in individual moments, in choices made by individual men, humanity survived. The Air Force Academy uses their story in ethics classes. Cadets study the tactical situation, damaged bomber, lone fighter, clear shot, explicit orders to destroy all enemy aircraft. Then the instructor asks, what do you do? The cadets argue. Most say shoot. Orders are absolute. Hesitation costs lives. War isn't the place for sentiment. But some cadets say don't shoot. Say there's a difference between a threat and a wreck. Say mercy, when possible, doesn't weaken you, it proves you're still human beneath the uniform. The debate never ends. Each class argues it fresh. And that's the point. The question shouldn't have an easy answer. Stigler's Me-109, the aircraft he flew that day, no longer exists. Scrapped after the war, melted down, recycled into peacetime machinery. But replica Me-109s at air shows now carry his story. Pilots flying them tell audiences about the escort over Bremen, about mercy given at 11,000 feet, about two old men who became brothers. Brown's B-17, Ye Olde Pub, also no longer exists. It was repaired, flew more missions, finally retired in 1945 and scrapped. But B-17s at museums and air shows carry its name, bear the scars it bore, represent the story of survival against impossible odds. Aviation historians debate the incident's uniqueness. Some say it happened more often than recorded, that mercy between pilots was more common than official histories acknowledge. Others say it was singular, an aberration, a moment so unlikely it proves nothing except that anomalies occur. But the historians miss something. It doesn't matter how common or rare such moments were. What matters is they happened at all. That in a war that killed 50 million people, that firebombed cities and murdered civilians and reduced entire nations to rubble, individual men still found space for mercy. Still made choices that defied logic and doctrine and orders. Those choices didn't stop the war. Didn't prevent the Holocaust or Hiroshima or the Soviet gulags. Didn't make the war less terrible or the deaths less tragic. But they preserved a crucial truth, that even in extremity, humans remain capable of compassion. That mercy, once offered, echoes forward through generations. That the bond between enemies who choose not to kill can become stronger than any alliance forged by nations. When Stigler died in 2008, Brown's family attended the funeral. They stood with Stigler's family, wept together, remembered a man they'd initially known only as the German pilot. When Brown died 8 months later, Stigler's family returned the gesture. Two families united by one choice, made in seconds, that shaped decades. The graves are separate, but the families aren't. They remain in contact. Celebrate holidays together. Share photographs and stories. Brown's grandson recently visited Stigler's granddaughter in Vancouver. They talked about their grandfathers, about mercy and war and the strange paths that connect lives across nations and time. Above the airfield in Bremen where it all happened, the sky is quiet now. Commercial airliners fly the same paths the bombers flew, carrying passengers who don't know that below them, 70 years ago, 10 men faced death and 1 man chose mercy. The sky remembers nothing. The earth holds no record. The war's scars have healed. But the story persists. It's told to children learning about World War II. To soldiers deploying to war zones. To anyone who wonders if humanity can survive humanity's worst moments. The story says, yes. Not easily. Not completely. But in individual choices, in moments of mercy given when killing is expected, humanity proves it can't be entirely destroyed. December 20, 1943. 2 aircraft flying formation over Germany. 1 American, 1 German. Enemies by nation, brothers by choice. In 15 minutes, they created a bond that lasted 68 years, touched hundreds of lives, reminded the world that war, for all its horror, couldn't completely erase what makes us human. That's not a small thing. That's everything.